One of them came towards me, and the other fled into the forest. But it quickly returned with 700 other beasts. As they approached me, I perceived that they were creatures with a human shape, who, however, went on all fours like some gigantic kind of monkey. They shouted with admiration when they saw me, and one of them took me up by the neck and flung me on his back, and galloped with me into a great town. When I saw the splendid buildings of the city, I recognized my mistake. The four-footed creatures were really enormous men. Seeing that I went on 2 legs, they would not believe that I was a man like themselves. They thought I was an animal without any reasoning power, and they resolved to send me to their queen, who was fond of collecting strange and curious monsters. All this, of course, I did not understand at the time. It took me some months to learn their language. These men of the moon have 2 dialects, one for the nobility, the other for the common people. The language of the nobility is a kind of music. It is certainly a very pleasant means of expression. They are able to communicate their thoughts by lutes and other musical instruments quite as well as by the voice. When 20 or 30 of them meet together to discuss some matter, they carry on the debate by the most harmonious concert it is possible to imagine. The common people, however, talk by agitating different parts of their bodies. Certain movements constitute an entire speech. By shaking a finger, a hand, or an arm, for instance, they can say more than we can in 1,000 words. Other motions, such as a wrinkle on the forehead, a shiver along a muscle, serve to design words. As they use all their body in speaking in this fashion, they have to go naked in order to make themselves clearly understood. When they are engaged in an exciting conversation, they seem to be creatures shaken by some wild fever. Instead of sending me at once to the Queen of the Moon, the man who had captured me earned a considerable amount of money by taking me every afternoon to the houses of the rich people. There I was compelled to jump and make grimaces, and stand in ridiculous attitudes in order to amuse the crowds of guests who had been invited to see the antics of the new animal. But one day, as my master was pulling the rope around my neck to make me rise up and divert the company, a man came and asked me in Greek who I was. Full of joy at meeting someone with whom I could talk, I related to him the story of my voyage from the earth. I cannot understand, I said, how it was I rose up to the moon when my machine broke down and fell to the earth. That is easily explained, he said. You had got within the circle of lunar influence, in which the moon exerts a sort of sucking action on the fat of the body. The same thing often happens to me. Like you, I am a stranger on the moon. I was born on the sun, but, being of a roving disposition, I like to explore one planet after another. I have traveled a good deal in Europe, and conversed with several persons whose names you no doubt know. I remember that I was once famous in ancient Greece as the demon of Socrates. Then you are a spirit? I exclaimed. A kind of spirit, he replied. I was one of the large company of the men of the sun who used to inhabit the earth under the names of oracles, nymphs, woodland elves, and fairies. but we abandoned our world in the reign of the Emperor Augustus. Your people then became so gross and stupid that we could no longer delight in their society. Since then I have stayed on the moon. I find its inhabitants more enlightened than the inhabitants of the earth. I don't. I exclaimed. Look how they treat me, as if I were a wild beast. I am sure that if one of their men of science voyaged to the earth, he would be better received than I am here. I doubt it, said the man of the Sunday. Your men of science would have him killed, stuffed, and put in a glass case in a museum. To the garb of shame at this point our conversation was broken off by my keeper. He saw that the company was tired of my talk, which seemed to them mere grunting. So he pulled my rope, and made me dance and caper until the spectators ached with laughter. Happily, the next morning the man of the sun opened my cage and put me on his back and carried me away. I have spoken to the king of the moon, he said, and he has commanded that you should be taken to his court and examined by his learned doctors. As my companion went on 4 feet, he was able to travel as fast as a race horse, and we soon arrived at another town, where we put up at an inn for dinner. I followed him into a magnificently furnished hall, and a servant asked me what I would begin with. Some soup, I replied. I had scarcely pronounced the words when I smelt a very succulent broth. I rose up to look for the source of this agreeable smell, but my companion stopped me. What do you want to walk away for? Said he. Stay and finish your soup. But where is the soup? I said. Ah, he replied. This is the first meal you have had on the moon. You see, the people here only live on the smell of food. The fine, lunar art of cookery consists in collecting the exhalations that come from cooked meat, and bottling them up. Then, at mealtime, the various jars are uncorked, one after the other, until the appetites of the diners are satisfied. It is, no doubt, an exquisite way of eating, I said, but I am afraid I shall starve on it. Oh, no, you will not, said he. You will soon find that a man can nourish himself as well by his nose as by his mouth. And so it was. After smelling for a quarter of an hour a variety of rich, appetizing vapors, I rose up quite satisfied. In the afternoon I was taken to the palace of the king, and examined by the greatest men of science on the moon. In spite of all that my friend had said on my behalf, I was adjudged to be a mere animal, and again shut up in a cage. The king, queen, and courtiers spent a considerable time every day watching me, and with the help of the man of the sun I soon learned to speak a little of their music language. This caused a great deal of surprise. Several persons began to think that I was really a man who had been dwarfed and weakened from want of nourishment. But the learned doctors again examined me, and decided that, as I did not walk on 4 legs, I must be a new kind of featherless parrot. Thereupon I was given a pole to perch on, instead of a nice warm bed to lie in, and every day the Queen's fowler used to come and whistle tunes for me to learn. In the meantime, however, I improved my knowledge of the language, and at last I spoke so well and intelligibly that all the courtiers said that the learned doctors had been mistaken. One of the queen's maids of honor not only thought that I was a man, but fell in love with me. She often used to steal to my cage, and listen to my stories of the customs and amusements of our world. She was so interested that she begged me to take her with me if ever I found a way of returning to the earth. In my examination by the learned doctors I had stated that their world was but a moon, and that the moon from which I had come was really a world. It was this which had made them angry against me. But my friend, the man of the sun, at last prevailed upon the king to let me out of the cage on my retracting my wicked heresy. I was clad in splendid robes, and placed on a magnificent chariot to which 4 great noblemen were harnessed, and led to the center of the city, where I had to make the following statement: "People, I declare to you that this moon is not a moon but a world, and that the world I come from is not a world but a moon. For this is what the royal council believe that you ought to believe." The man of the sun then helped me to descend from the chariot, and took me quickly into a house, and stripped me of my gorgeous robes. "Why do you do that?" I asked. "This is the most splendid dress I have ever seen on the moon." "It is a garb of shame," said my companion. "You have this day undergone the lowest degradation that can be imposed on a man. You committed an awful crime in saying that the moon was not a moon. It is a great wonder you were not condemned to die of old age." "Die of old age?" I said. "Yes," replied my companion. "Usually, when a man of the moon comes to that time of life in which he feels that he is losing his strength of mind and body, he invites all his friends to a banquet. After explaining what little hope he has of adding anything to the fine actions of his life, he asks for permission to depart. If he has led a bad life, he is ordered to live, but if he has been a good man, his dearest friend kisses him, and plunges a dagger in his heart." As he was talking, the son of the man in whose house we were staying entered the room. My companion quickly rose on his 4 feet, and made the young man a profound bow. I asked him why he did this. He told me that on the moon parents obey their children, and old men are compelled to show to young men the greatest respect. "They are of opinion," said my companion, "that a strong and active young man is more capable of governing a family than a dull, infirm sexagenarian. I know that on your earth old men are supposed to be wise and prudent. But, as a matter of fact, their wisdom and prudence consists merely of a timid frame of mind and a disinclination to take any risks." The father then entered the room, and his son said to him in an angry voice, "Why have you not got our house ready to sail away? You know the walls of the city have gone some hours ago. Bring me at once your image." The man brought a great wooden image of himself, and his son whipped it furiously for a quarter of an hour. "And now," said the young man at last, "go and hoist the sails at once. 3 marvels of the moon. There are 2 kinds of towns on the moon, traveling towns and sedentary towns. In the traveling towns, each house is built of very light wood, and placed on a platform, beneath the four corners of which great wheels are fixed. When the time arrives for a voyage to the seaside or the forest, for a change of air, the townspeople hoist vast sails on the roofs of their dwellings, and sail away altogether towards the new site. In the sedentary towns, on the other hand, the houses are made with great strong screws running from the cellars to the roofs, which enable them to be raised or lowered at discretion. The depth of the cellar is equal to the height of every house. In winter, the whole structure is lowered below the surface of the ground. In spring, it is lifted up again by means of the screw. As, owing to the father's neglect, the house in which we were staying could not set sail until the next day, my companion and I accepted an invitation to stay the night there. Our host then sent for a doctor, who prescribed what foods I should smell, and what kind of bed I should lie in. "But I am not sick," I said to the man of the Sunday. "If you were," he replied, "the doctor would not have been sent for. On the moon, doctors are not paid to cure men, but to keep them in good health. They are officers of the state, and, once a day, they call at every house, and instruct the inmates how to preserve their natural vigor." "I wish," I said, "you could get him to order me a dozen roasted larks instead of the mere smell of them. I should like to taste some solid food just for a change." He spoke to the doctor, and at a sign from him, our host took a gun and led me into his garden. "Are those the kind of birds you mean?" he said, pointing to a great swarm of larks singing high up in the sky. I replied that they were, and he shot at them, and 30 larks tumbled over at our feet, not merely dead, but plucked, seasoned, and roasted. "You see," said my host, "we mix with our gunpowder and shot a certain composition which cooks as well as kills." I picked up one of the birds and ate it. In sober truth, I have never tasted on earth anything so deliciously roasted. When I had finished my repast, I was conducted to a little room, the floor of which was strewn with fine orange blossoms about 3 feet deep. The men of the moon always sleep on these thick, soft heaps of fragrant flowers, which are chosen for them every day by their doctors. 4 servants came and undressed me, and gently rubbed my limbs and my body, and in a few moments I was fast asleep. Early next morning I was awakened by the man of the sun, who said to me, "I know you are anxious to return to your earth and relate the story of all the strange and wonderful things you have seen on the moon. If you care to while away an hour or two over this book, I will prepare for your return voyage." The book which he put into my hand was an extraordinary object. It was a kind of machine, full of delicate springs, and it looked like a new kind of clock. In order to read it, you had to use, not your eyes, but your ears. For on touching one of the springs, it began to speak like a man. It was a history of the sun, and I was still listening to it when my companion arrived. "I am now ready," he said. "On what part of the earth would you like to land?" "In Italy," I replied. "That will save me the cost and trouble of traveling to Rome, a city I have always longed to see." Taking me in his arms, the man of the sun rose swiftly up from the moon and carried me across the intervening space, and dropped me rather roughly on a hill near Rome. When I turned to expostulate with him, I found that he had disappeared. Bjornstjerne Bjornson, one of the greatest Scandinavian writers, was born at Kvin, in the wild region of the Dufra Mountains, Norway, the 8th of December, 1832. His father was the village pastor. 6 years later the family removed to Naset, on the west coast of Norway. From the grammar school at Molde young Bjornson went to the University of Christiania, and it was then that he began to write verses and newspaper articles. At Uppsala, in 1856, he understood that he had a definite call to literature, and at Copenhagen the following year he wrote his first masterpiece Sin of Solbakken. This was followed, in 1858, by Arne Story, which not only brought him into the front rank of contemporary writers, but also marked a new era in Norwegian literature. From that time there has been a succession of novels, short stories, and plays. Bjornson on 2 occasions has been the director of a theatre, from his pen. A drama, The King, produced in 1877, had an after-effect of immense political importance. It was undoubtedly an attack on the ruler of Norway and Sweden, and every Norwegian who wished his country to become an independent nation welcomed Bjornson as the leader of this new movement, with what success there is now no need to relate, since it has become a matter of history. Bjornson died the 25th of April, 1910. The little songmaker. It was up at Kampen that Arne was born. His mother was Margit, the only child at the little farm among the crags. When she was 18, she stopped too long at a dance one evening. Her friends had gone off without her, so Margit thought the way home would be just as long whether she waited till the end of the dance or not. Thus it came about that Margit remained sitting there till Nils Skræther, the fiddler, suddenly laid aside his instrument, as was his wont when he had had more than enough to drink, left the dancers to hum their own tune, took hold of the prettiest girl he could find, and, letting his feet keep as good time to the dance as music to a song, jerked off with the heel of his boot the hat of the tallest man in the room. "Ho!" laughed he. As Margit walked home that night, the moon was making wondrous sport over the snow. When she got to the loft where she slept, she could not help looking out at it again. Next time there was a dance in the parish, Margit was present. She did not care much to dance that evening, but sat listening to the music. But when the playing ceased the fiddler rose and went straight across to Margit Kampen. She was scarcely aware of anything, but that she was dancing with Nils Skræther. Before long the weather grew warmer, and there was no more dancing that spring. One Sunday, when the summer was getting on, Margit went to church with her mother. When they were at home again her mother threw both her arms around her. "Hide nothing from me, my child," she cried. Winter came again, but Margit danced no more. Nils Skræther went on playing, drank more than formerly, and wound up each party by dancing with the prettiest girl there. It was said for certain that he could have whichever he wished of the farmer's daughters, and that Birgit, the daughter of Bean, was sick for love of him. Just about this time a child of the cotter's daughter at Kampen was brought to be christened. It was given the name of Arn, and its father was said to be Niels Skrather. The evening of that day saw Niels at a great wedding party. He would not play, but drank all he could, and was dancing the whole time. But when he asked Birgit Bean for a dance, she refused him. He turned and took hold of the first good-looking girl near. She, too, held back, and answered a request he whispered in her ear with the words, "The dance might go further than I should like." At that Niels drew back, and danced the Hålig alone. Then he went into the barn, laid himself down, and wept. Margit sat at home with her little boy. She heard about Niels going from dance to dance, and it was not very long before Arn learned that Niels Skrather was his father, and the kind of man he was. It was when Arn was about 6 years old that two Americans, visiting the place when a bridal party was going on, were so much struck by the way Niels danced the Hålig that they proposed to take him as their servant, at whatever wages he wanted. They would call for him on their way back in about a week's time. Niels was the hero of the evening. The dance was resumed. Niels looked round at the girls, and went over to Birgit Bean. He held out his hand, and she put out hers. Then, turning away with a laugh, he put his arm around the girl next to her, and danced off with boisterous glee. Birgit colored, and a tall, quiet-looking man took her hand, and danced away. Niels noticed it, and presently danced so hard against them that both Birgit and her partner fell to the ground. The quiet-looking man got up, went straight to Niels, took him by the arm, and knocked him down with a blow over the eyes. Niels fell heavily, tried to rise, and found that he couldn't. His back was badly hurt. Meantime, at Kampen, no sooner had the grandmother succeeded in paying off the last installment of debt on the farm than she was stricken with mortal sickness and died. A fortnight after the funeral 6 men brought in a litter, and on the litter lay Niels with his black hair and pale face. In the springtime, a year after he had been brought to Kampen, Niels and Margit were married. The fiddler's health was ruined, but he was able to help in the fields, and look after things. Then, one Sunday afternoon, when Niels and Arn were out together, they saw a wedding procession, 14 carriages in all. Niels stood for a long time motionless after the bride and bridegroom had passed, and for the rest of the day he was sullen and angry. He went out before supper, and returned at midnight, drunk. From that day Niels was constantly going into town and coming home drunk. He reproached Margit for his wretched life, he cursed her, he struck her, and beat her. Then would come fits of wild remorse. As Arn grew up, Niels took him to dances, and the boy learned to sing all sorts of songs. His mother taught him to read, and when he was 15 he longed to travel and to write songs. At home, things got worse. As Niels grew feebler he became more drunken and violent, and often Arn would stay at home to amuse him in order that Margit might have an hour's peace. Arn began to loathe his father, but he kept this feeling to himself, as he did his love for his mother. His one friend was Kristen, the eldest son of a sea captain. With Kristen, An could talk of books and travel. But there came a day when Kristen went away to be a sailor, and An was left alone. Life was very heavy for him. He made up songs and put his grief into them. But for his mother, An would have left camp, and he stood between her and Nils. One night, about this time, Nils came back late from a wedding feast. Margit had gone to bed, and An was reading. The boy helped his father upstairs, and Nils began quoting texts from the Bible and cursing his own downfall, shedding drunken tears. Presently he made his way to the bed, and put his fingers on Margit's throat. In vain the boy and his mother called on Nils to desist. The drunkard took no notice. An rushed to a corner of the room and picked up an axe. At the same moment Nils fell down, and, after a piercing shriek, lay quite still. All that night they watched by the dead. A feeling of relief came upon them both. He fell of himself, An said simply, for at first his mother was terrified by the sight of the axe. Remember, An, it's for your sake I've borne it all, Margit said, weeping. You must never leave me. Never, never, he answered fervently. To the call of the mountains An grew up reserved and shy. He went on tending the cattle and making songs. He was now in his 20th year. The pastor lent him books to read, the only thing he cared for. Many a time he would have liked to read aloud to his mother, but he could not bring himself to do it. One of the songs he made at this time began, "The parish is all restless, but there's peace in grove and wood. No beadle here impounds you, to suit his crabbed mood, no strife profanes our little church, though there it rages high, but then we have no little church, and that, perhaps, is why." The folks round about got to hear of his songs, and would have been glad to talk to him, but An was shy of people and disliked them, chiefly because he thought they disliked him. He gave up tending the cattle, and stayed at home, looking after the farm. He was near his mother all day now, and she would give him dainty meals. In his heart was a song with the refrain "Over the mountains high." Somehow, An could never finish this song. There was a field laborer named Upland Nut, at whose side An often worked. This man had neither parents nor friends, and when An said to him, "Have you no one at all, then, to love you?" he answered, "Ah, no. I have no one." An thought of his own mother, and his heart was full of love to her. What if he were to lose her because he had not sufficiently prized her, he thought, and he rushed home, to find his mother sleeping gently like a child. Mother and son were much together in those days, and once they agreed to go to a wedding at a neighboring farm. For the first time in his life An drank too much, and all next day he lay in the barn. He was full of self-reproach, and it seemed to him that cowardice was his besetting sin. Cowardice had been his failing as a boy. It had prevented him taking his mother's part against his father, from leaving home, from mixing with people. Cowardice had made him drunk, and, but for his fear and timidity, his verses would be better. After searching everywhere for him, Margit eventually found him in the barn. He tried to soothe her, and vowed that he would join his life more closely to his mother's in future. What moved him was that his loving, patient mother said that she had done a grievous wrong against him, and implored his forgiveness. "Of course, I forgive you," he said. "God bless you, my dear, dear Anne." From that day, Anne was not only happier at home, but he began to look at other people more kindly, more with his mother's gentle eyes. But he still went about alone, and a strange longing often possessed his soul. One summer evening Anne had gone out to sit by the Black Lake, a piece of water very dark and deep. He sat behind some bushes and looked out over the water, and at the hills opposite, and at the homesteads in the valley. Presently he heard voices close beside him. A young girl, he made out, was grumbling because she had got to leave the parsonage, where she had been staying with Mathilde, the parson's daughter, and it was her father who was taking her home. A third voice, sharp and strident, was heard. "Hurry up, now, Bard, push off the boat, or we shan't be home tonight." The rattle of cart wheels followed, and Bard fetched a box out of the cart, and carried it down to the boat. Then Mathilde, the parson's daughter, came running up calling, "Eli! Eli!" The two girls wept in each other's arms. "You must take this," said Mathilde, giving her friend a bird cage. "Mother wants you to." "Yes, you must take Nerifus, and then you'll often think of me." "Eli! Come, come, Eli," came the summons from the boat. A moment after, and Anne saw the boat out in the water, Eli standing up in the stern, holding the bird cage and waving her hand to Mathilde. His eyes followed the boat, and he watched it draw near to the land. He could see the three forms mirrored in the water, and continued gazing until they had left the boat and gone indoors at the biggest house on the opposite side of the lake. Mathilde had sat for some time by the landing stage, but she had left now, and Anne was alone when Eli came out again for a last look across the water. Anne could see her image in the lake. "Perhaps she sees me now," he thought. Then, when the sun had set, he got up and went home, feeling that all things were at peace. Anne's fancies for some time now were of dreams of love and fair maidens. Old ballads and romances mirrored them for him, as the water had mirrored the young girl. A twofold longing, the yearning to have someone to love, and a desire to do something great, sprang up together in his soul, and melted into one. Again he began to work at the song, "Over the Mountains High," altering it, and thinking each time, "One day it will carry me off." But he never forgot his mother in his thoughts of travel, and decided that he would send for her as soon as he had got a footing abroad. There was in the parish a merry old fellow of the name of Ejner Assen. He was well off, and, in spite of a lameness that made him use a crutch, was fond of organizing parties of children to go nutting. All the young people called him Godfather. Assen liked Anne, and invited him to join in the next nutting party, and though On blushed, and made excuses, he decided to go. He found himself the only young man among many girls. They were not the maidens of whom he had made songs, nor yet was he afraid of them. They were more full of life than anything he had seen, and they could make merry over anything. All of them laughed at On, as they caught at the branches, because he was serious, so that he could not help laughing himself. After a while they all sat on a large knoll, old Asen in the middle, and told stories. And then they were anxious to tell their dreams, but this could be done only to one person, and On was trusted to hear the dreams. The last of the girls to tell her dreams was called Eli, and she was the girl he had seen in the boat. On had to say which was the best dream, and as he said he wanted time to think, they left him sitting on the knoll and trooped off with Godfather. On sat for some time, and the old yearnings to travel came back, and drove him to his song, over the mountains high. Now, at last, he had got the words, and taking paper out of his pocket, he wrote the song through to the end. When he had finished he rose, and left the paper on the knoll, and later, when he found he had forgotten it, he went back. But the paper was gone. One of the girls, who had returned to seek him, had found not On, but his song. Three loves awakening whenever On mentioned his friend Kristen, and wondered why he never heard from him. His mother left the room, and seemed unhappy for days afterwards. He noticed, too, that she would get specially nice meals for him at such times. He had never been so gentle since his father's death as he was that winter. On Sundays he would read a sermon to his mother, and go to church with her, but she knew this was only to win her consent to his going abroad in the spring. Upland Nut, who had always been alone, now came to live at Campen. On had become very skillful with axe and saw, and that winter he was often busy at the parsonage as well as Campen. One day a messenger came from Bean to ask him if he would go over there for some carpentry work. He answered yes without thinking about the matter. As soon as the man had gone, his mother told him that it was Bard Bean who had injured his father, but On decided to go all the same. It was a fine homestead, and Bard and On soon became on friendly terms. He had many talks, too, with Eli, and at times would sing his own songs to her, and afterwards feel ashamed. Then Eli fell ill, and Birgit blamed Bard because Mathild had gone away from the parsonage on a visit to town without bidding goodbye to Eli. It seemed to Bard that whatever he did was wrong. "You either keep silent too much, or you talk too much," said his wife. During Eli's illness Bard would often sit and talk with On, and one day he told him how he had been driven to attack Nils, and then how he had courted and won Birgit. "She was very melancholy at first," said Bard, "and I had nothing to say, and then she got into bustling, domineering ways, and I had nothing to say to that. But one day of real happiness I've not had the 20 years we've been married." When Eli was getting better, her mother came down one evening and asked On, in her daughter's name, to go up and sing to her. Eli had heard him singing. On was confused, but gave in and went upstairs. The room was in darkness, and he had not seen Eli since the day she had fallen ill, and he had helped to carry her to her room. Anne sat down in a chair at the foot of the bed. When people talk in the dark, they are generally more truthful than when they see one another's faces. Eli made Anne sing to her, first a hymn, and then a song of his own. For some time there was silence between them, and then Eli said, "I wonder, Anne, that you, who have so much that is beautiful within, should want to go away. You must not go away." "There are times when I seem not to want to so much," he answered. Presently Anne could hear her weeping, and he felt that he must move either forward or back. "Eli." "Yes." Both voices were at a whisper. "Give me your hand." She made no answer. He listened, quickly, closely, stretched out his own hand, and grasped a warm little hand that lay bare. There was a step on the stairs, they let go of one another, and Bridget entered with a light. "You've been sitting too long in the dark," she said, putting the candle on the table. But neither Eli nor Anne could bear the light. She turned to the pillow, and he shaded his face with his hands. "Ah, yes, it's a bit dazzling at first," said the mother, "but the feeling soon passes away." Next day Anne heard that Eli was better and going to come down for a time after dinner. He at once put his tools together, and bade farewell to the farm. And when Eli came downstairs he was gone. For after many years it was springtime when Margaret went up to the parsonage. There was something heavy on her heart. Letters had come from Kristen for Anne, and she had been afraid to give them to her son lest he should go away and join his friend. Kristen had even sent money, and this Margaret had given to Anne, pretending it had been left him by his grandmother. All this Margaret poured out to the old pastor, and also her fears that Anne would go travelling. "Ah," he said, smiling, "if only there was some little lassie who could get hold of him. Eli Bean, eh? And if he could manage so that they could meet sometimes at the parsonage." Margaret looked up anxiously. "Well, we'll see what we can do," he went on, "for, to tell you the truth, my wife and daughter have long been of the same mind." Then came the summer, and one day, when the heavens were clear, Anne walked out and threw himself down on the grass. He meant to go to the parsonage and borrow a newspaper. He had not been to Bean since that night in the sick room, and now he glanced towards the house, and then turned away his eyes. Presently he heard someone singing his song, the song he had lost the very day he made it. "Fain would I know what the world may be over the mountains high. Mine eyes can naught but the white snow see, and up the steep sides the dark fir tree, that climbs as if yearning to know. Say, tree, dost thou venture to go?" There were 8 verses, and Anne stood listening till the last word had died away. He must see who it was, and presently above him he caught sight of Eli. The sunlight was falling straight on her, and it seemed to Anne, as he looked at her, that he had never seen or dreamt of anything more beautiful in his life. He watched her get up, without letting himself be seen, and presently she was gone. Anne no longer wanted to go to the parsonage, but he went and sat where she had sat, and his breast was full of gentle feelings. Eli often went to the parsonage, and one Sunday evening Margaret found her there, and persuaded the girl to walk back to Campen with her. Eli entered the house only when she heard that Anne was not at home. It was the first time she had visited the homestead. Margaret took her all over the house, and showed her Anne's room, and opened a little chest full of silk kerchiefs and ribbons. "He bought something each time he's been to the town," Margaret remarked. Eli would have given anything to go away, but she dared not speak. In a special compartment in the chest she had seen a buckle, a pair of gold rings, and a hymn book bound with silver clasps, and wrought on the clasps was, "Eli Bard's databeen." The mother put back the things, closed the box, and clasped the girl to her heart, for Eli was weeping. When they were downstairs again, they heard a man's step in the passage, and Anne entered, and saw Eli. "You here?" he said, and blushed a fiery red. Then he put his arms around her, and she leant her head on his breast. He whispered something in her ear, and for a long while they stood in silence, her arms around his neck. As they walked home together in the fair summer evening, they could utter but few words in their strange, new happiness. Nature interpreted their hearts to one another, and on his way back from that first summer night's walk, Anne made many new songs. It was harvest time when the marriage of Eli with Anne was celebrated. The black water was full of boats taking people to Bean. All the doors were open at the house. Eli was in her room with Mathilde and the pastor's wife. Anne was downstairs looking out from the window. Presently Bard and Birgit, both dressed for church, met on the stairs, and went up together to a garret where they were alone. Bard had something to say, but it was hard to say it. "Birgit," he began, "you've been thinking, as I've been, I dare say. He stood between us two, I know, and it's gone on a long time. Today a son of his has come into our house, and to him we've given our only daughter. Birgit, can't we, too, join our hearts today?" His voice trembled, but no answer came. They heard Eli outside, calling gently, "Aren't you coming, Mother?" "Yes, I'm coming now, dear," said Birgit, in a choking voice. She walked across the room to Bard, took his hand in hers, and broke into violent sobs. The two hands clung tight, and it was hand in hand they opened the door and went downstairs. And when the bridal train streamed down to the landing stage, and Anne gave his hand to Eli, Bard, against all custom, took Birgit's hand in his own and followed them calmly, happily, smilingly. In the boat his eyes rested on the bridal pair and on his wife. "Ah," he said to himself, "no one would have thought such a thing possible 20 years ago." In God's Way belongs to the second group of Bjornson's novels, of which the first group is represented by early peasant tales like Anne. In this later category the stories are of a more or less didactic nature. Although In God's Way lacks something of the freshness and beauty that distinguished Anne, it is, nevertheless a powerful and vivid picture of Norwegian religious life, and it is, of all Bjørnson's books, the one by which he is most widely known outside his native country. In this story Bjørnson has been influenced by the social dramas of his compatriot, Ibsen, but it may be questioned whether he has not brought to his task a higher inspiration and a stronger faith in humanity than the famous dramatist possessed. Published in 1889, the main theme of In God's Way was undoubtedly suggested by the religious excitement which then prevailed in Norway. A strange homecoming pastor Tuft was walking up and down his study, composing his Sunday sermon. He was a handsome man, with a long, fair face, and dreamy eyes. His wife, Josephine, in the days when she thought she was in love with him, used to call him Melanchthon. That was not many years ago, and he still resembled in appearance the poet of the Reformation. But his features had now lost their fine serenity, and he was glad when his bitter and troubled thoughts on the doctrine of justification, a subject he had chosen for its bearing on his brother-in-law's conduct, were interrupted by his wife. Josephine burst into his study in a state of fierce excitement. "They will be here in a moment," she said. "The steamer has arrived. Oh, that woman, that woman. She has ruined my brother's life. If he wanted to settle again in Norway with her," said the pastor, "couldn't he have chosen some spot where the story of their misconduct was not known? But to come to the very town. Everybody will remember." "Yes," said Josephine, "it is only 6 years since Edward ran off to America with Soren Kuhl's wife. Surely, he will not expect you, a minister, to receive the woman, especially as Kuhl is still living." While she was talking, Tuft stared out of the window. A tall man in light clothes was coming to the house, a tall man, with a clear-cut, sunburnt face, and a lean, curved nose that gave him the air of a bird of prey. By his side was a lady with sweet, delicate features, dressed in a tartan traveling costume. There was a knock at the door. Josephine went down very slowly, and opened it. "Edward." There was a glow in her eyes as she welcomed her brother, and his eyes also lighted up. He was about to cross the threshold, when he noticed that she completely disregarded his companion. In the meantime, Tuft had come to the door. He, too, made no advances. There was always something of the keen, wild look of an eagle about Edward Callum. It became still more striking as he glared at his sister and brother-in-law. "Are you waiting," he said, "for me to introduce my wife? Well, here she is, Ragni Callum." So the pair had married in America. If Tuft and Josephine had not been so eager to impute every sort of misconduct to runaways, they would have foreseen this natural event. Tuft tried to find something to say, but failed, and glanced at Josephine. But she did not look as if she were willing to help him. For the fact that Edward and Ragni were now married increased rather than diminished Josephine's bitterness. Although she would not admit it to herself, her religious objections were a mere pretense. She was jealous with the strange jealousy of a sister who wanted to be all in all to her brilliant brother, and hated that another woman should be more to him than she was. All her life had been centered on him. She had married Ole Tuft, a poor peasant's son, because he was the bosom friend of Edward. Her marriage, she thought, would connect them still more closely. She wanted to live by his side, watching him rise into fame as the greatest doctor in Norway. For young Callum's masters had predicted that he would prove to be a man of genius. Possessing considerable wealth, he had taken up the study of medicine, not as a means of livelihood, but as a matter of love and duty. Then, 6 years ago, he had run off with old Soren Kuhl's young wife, and Josephine's dream had come to an end, leaving her life little more than a dull, empty round of routine housework. This was why she now gazed with hard, cold eyes at Ragni. Edward Callum saw her look of wild hatred, and, taking his weeping wife gently by the arm, he turned away, and led her from the house into the road. Josephine went upstairs, and gazed from the study window at the retreating figures. Her husband followed her, with a curious look in his eyes. Neither of them spoke. In their hearts was raging a storm of passion wilder than the anger which possessed Callum, and the sorrow which bowed down Ragni. Josephine left the room without looking at her husband. He gazed after her still with the same curious look in his eyes. Then, pulling himself together, he went on writing his sermon. "What makes God so merciful to sinners?" he wrote. "His infinite love. Yes, justification is certainly an act of mercy, but it is also an act of judgment. The claims of the law must be first fulfilled. A sinner must believe in order to be saved." The point in this was that Edward Callum was a Friedhinker. There could be no forgiveness for him. At the bottom of his heart, Tuft was glad that there had been no reconciliation. Ever since he had married the wealthy and beautiful sister of his bosom friend, he had been jealous of Josephine's passionate attachment to her brother. Her brother had remained her hero, and the peasant she had married and enriched was little more than her servant. While, with these bitter thoughts in his head, Tuft was composing his sermon, Josephine was writing a dastardly letter. It was to Soren Kuhl. Edward and Ragni had returned, married. There was an empty house near the one they had bought. Would Soren Kuhl come and live in it? So the letter ran. The next day, Sunday, Josephine went to church in a very Christian-like frame of mind. She felt she had done her duty, and avenged herself in doing it. To the poison of tongues at first things did not go as Josephine expected. With the exception of his sister and brother-in-law, everybody welcomed Edward Callum and his wife back to his native town. At the house of Pastor Meek, the oldest and most influential of the clergy, Ragni was introduced to a middle-aged lady, who startled her by saying, "I am Soren Kuhl's sister. I want to tell you that, in your position, I should have acted just as you did." This, indeed, was the general verdict. No one who knew Soren Kuhl blamed Ragni. An old rake, blind and half paralyzed as the immediate result of ill living, he had worried his first wife, Ragni's sister, into the grave, and then taken advantage of the young girl's innocence to marry her. The man was a mass of corruption, and his second marriage was one of those strangely cruel crimes which go unpunished in the present state of society. Callum, who was then lodging in the same house as Cool, was maddened by it. Being a doctor, he foresaw clearly the fate of the pure, lovely, girlish victim of Cool's brutal passion, and in rescuing her from it he had displayed, in the opinion of his friends, the chivalry of soul of a modern knight-errant. Pastor Meek was a liberal-minded and courageous old man. He showed his sympathy with the Callums, and his trust in them, in a practical manner. "My grandson, Kyle," he said to Callum, "is at school here. I wish you would let him come, now and then, to your house. He is only 19 years old, but he promises to be a first-rate composer. Your wife plays the piano beautifully. They ought to get on well together." Callum was so pleased with this mark of approval that he went the next morning to the young musician's lodgings, and invited him to come and live with him. Kyle Meek was a lanky, awkward hobbledehoy, with a tousled head of hair and long red hands, which were always covered with chilblains. Ragni asked him to play a simple duet, but he made so many mistakes in playing that she got up from the piano. He was upset, and ran away from the house. Callum spent an afternoon looking for him, and brought him back with his hair cut, his nails trimmed, and his clothes brushed. "Can't you see," said Callum to his wife, "the lad's shy and afraid of you? Do, my dear, make him feel quite at home." Ragni was a sweet and gentle woman, and though she did not like Kyle much at first, she took him in hand, and, little by little, obtained a great influence over the wild creature. As his fine poetic nature gradually revealed itself, she began to mother him. They were often seen walking out together, and as soon as the snow was firm, they used to go and meet Callum, and drive home with him, each standing on one of the runners of his sledge. One afternoon, after they had been skating together on the frozen bay, they were returning, without Callum, when a carriage barred their way. At the sound of Ragni's voice, the man inside said, "There she goes." "Who is it with her?" "Another man." "Ah, I thought that's what would happen." Ragni shuddered. It was Sorencool. The paralyzed old rake turned his blind face upon her, as though he could see her, and had caught her doing wrong. The carriage stopped by the next house to the Callums. Before Cool could get out, Ragni had run indoors. Shortly afterwards her husband arrived. She saw that he, too, had met Cool, and he saw that she had gone into the bedroom to hide herself. She buried her head in his arms. It seemed to her that the air was now full of evil spirits. And so it was. Edward Callum did not know it, as he was now too busy to go out anywhere. He was spending a great deal of his wealth in fitting out a private hospital for the study and treatment of the diseases that he specialized in. But Kyle Meek soon became aware of malign influences working around him, and around the two persons for whom he would willingly, nay, happily, have laid down his life. He met an old friend in the street, who said to him, "How do you stand in regard to Mrs. Callum?" Carl did not take in his meaning, and began to praise Ragni enthusiastically. "Yes, I know all about that," his friend interrupted. "But, to make a clean breast of it, are you her lover?" "How dare you, how dare you!" cried Carl. His friend quietly said that he only wanted to warn Carl. The report had certainly got about. "You've been a great deal together, you know," said his friend. "That has given the scandalmongers something to go on." Both Edward and Ragni saw that something had happened to Carl when he returned. He was in a black mood, he did not speak, his blue eyes were, by turns, strangely savage and strangely sorrowful. He had to go home at once, he said. He could not tell them now what the matter was, but he would write to them, as soon as he could pluck up the courage to do so. He packed his luggage, and Callum went to see him off. A few days afterwards, Ragni received a letter from Carl. He was going to Berlin, he said, to take up the study of music seriously. And then, for 4 pages, he talked about his prospects. But there was another page, a loose one, on which was written in red ink, "Read this when you are alone." "I have decided," Ragni Carl wrote, "that it would be wisest to tell you why I left so suddenly. Someone has started a dreadful slander against us. If I do not now tell you, you will hear it from the lips of some enemy. Ah, God! That I should have brought this upon you. Love you. Of course I love you. How could I help doing so, after all your kindness to me? And as for Edward, I worship the ground he treads on. He is the noblest man I have ever met. But do not show him this letter. Spare him the evil news as long as possible. Now that I have gone away, it may all blow over." Callum did not get home from the hospital that night until 8 o'clock. When he came home, his wife was lying in bed with a headache. She did not get up the next morning. She was in bed several days. When at last she got up, her husband noticed that she had grown very thin, her face had a tired, delicate expression, there were dark rings around her sweet eyes, and she was troubled with a cough. The fell work of slander. Ragni now did not stir outside her own door. She longed for fresh air, but she would not go out into the town for fear of the cruel, curious eyes of the scandalmongers. Soren Kuhl haunted her. His house overlooked her garden, and she got the strange fancy into her head that he was always sitting at the window blindly listening for her. So she never even went for a walk in the park-like grounds which Callum had purchased wholly for her pleasure. The poison of scandal had done its work. Her husband, unfortunately, never suspected that she was really ill. He had a deep longing for a child of his marriage, and, misled by too eager a hope, he misinterpreted the strange alteration in his wife's health. But one evening, when she coughed, some blood came up. Callum saw it, and the hideous truth came upon him in a blinding flash. It was the terrible disease which he had spent the greater part of his fortune in fighting against. Tuberculosis. But how was it that it had come so suddenly, and ravaged her dear, sweet, tender body so furiously? She was in a galloping consumption, and the end was not far off, a few weeks, a few days, perhaps. "Darling," he said, coming to her bedside one day, "isn't there some secret you would like to confide in me, some secret that has been hurting and distressing you? Tell me, dearest, for I shall have no peace until I know it." "I will tell you," she said. "I have just been thinking about it. You will find some papers in my writing table, they are all for you. Read them, dear." When she broke off abruptly by and by, "You will understand that it was for your sake I kept it secret." He went downstairs, and in the writing table he found Carl's letter. Horror, indignation, and helplessness overcame him. Why had he not known of this in time? He would have gone to every soul in the town, and told them that they lied. He said, "I will tell them so yet. They have murdered her, cowardly murdered her. Ah, God, I have spent my life and my fortune in my endeavors to benefit them, and there's not one of them, not one honest enough to tell me to defend my wife's good name." What drove him almost to madness was that there was none he could go to and take by the throat, exclaiming, "You have done this. You are answerable to me for this." Still, there was one who stood apart from the others, Josephine. Josephine had not invented the slander, that was not her way. But she would believe what was invented when it concerned anyone she disliked. And how she disliked Ragni. Yes, it was Josephine and her hypocrite of a husband who had laid his darling open to this sort of attack. Very well. Everything else was gone, his joy of life, his interest in science, and his love of mankind. But he still had something to live for: vengeance. As he was sitting one evening by the bedside of his wife, the door opened, and Carl Meek came into the room. "Is she dead?" said the boy. Ragni heard the question. She looked up, and tried to smile. Her eyes rested for a moment on Carl, and then remained on her husband. A moment after she was dead. Josephine was surprised to hear that Carl Meek was the only person whom her brother allowed to follow the coffin of his dead wife. Did that mean that Edward did not suspect him? Or, more likely, that he had forgiven him? Ah, if one could be as good as that! "God's way with sinners," said Tuft, "may seem cruel, but it is really kind and merciful. The death of that woman will work for Edward's good, of course. He feels it keenly now, but he will get over it. It is a blessing in disguise." As soon as Tuft uttered these words he felt the sheer brutality of them. By a strange irony of fate, his own child had fallen ill about the time that Ragni took to her bed, and the minister and his wife were now talking over the couch of their suffering little boy. Something was wrong with his chest, and Josephine would have liked to call in her clever brother in place of the ordinary family doctor, but she would not humble herself to beg his help. Perhaps it was the shock of her husband's words that aroused her, but that night the springs of her nature were strangely opened. She came downstairs in her night-dress to Tuft's bed, and awoke him. Her eyes were fixed in a blank stare. "I can't sleep, Ole," she whispered. "I want to warn you. That woman Edward's wife is trying to take away our boy. We have been too hard on her, too hard. Now she will make us pay for it." "You are not yourself," Josephine said Tuft, rising up, and dressing himself hastily. "I will fetch the doctor." "No, no," she cried. "Ask Edward to come." Tuft did not dare do this himself, but he got his doctor to approach Callum, who made an appointment to examine the child early next morning. Josephine shrieked when she saw him. Under the stress of mental suffering, the flesh on his face had wasted to the bone. He was the image of death. Without speaking to either of the parents, he went to the child, tapped its chest lightly here and there, and then said something to the doctor and went out. "He has gone to get his instruments," the doctor whispered. "The case is extremely serious. An operation must be performed at once." Josephine did not speak, neither did Tuft. They had been watching Callum's face as he bent over their boy, and in it they seemed to read the sentence of death. They had called him in too late. They were mistaken. Edward Callum came hurrying back with a staff of trained assistants. Tuft and Josephine were locked outside their child's room. An hour afterwards the door was opened. The boy's life was saved. This they learned from their own doctor, but Callum himself departed without even speaking to them. For the reconciliation that night, over the body of the sleeping child, Ole Tuft at last dealt sternly and truly with himself. 3 times, in the course of the day, had he gone to Callum's house to thank him for saving his boy's life. But Callum had refused to see him. At the 3rd refusal Tuft understood. If ever he entered his brother-in-law's house he would enter it a changed man. He was now vowing that he would begin this new life by uniting Edward and Josephine. It was his jealousy, he admitted to himself, which had been the root of all the mischief. Edward had been his hero, too, in his younger days, and it was this common worship of a nobler and more gifted nature which had brought him and Josephine together. Why had he not let it remain the base of their intercourse? Their marriage would then have been a happy one, and his own life would have been filled with larger thoughts and more generous feelings. While Pastor Tuft was meditating, his wife was acting. She too had been refused admittance to her brother's house. So she was writing to him. For whatever wrong they might have done, she said, they wished to make amends. They had been intolerant, she allowed, and they were sorry for it. But surely they were worthy to be accused. Would he not, then, tell them plainly what they had done to make him so angry? Some days afterwards, Josephine received a large envelope addressed to her by her brother. But she was surprised, on opening it, to find that it was full of papers in 2 strange handwritings. They were letters to Callum, from Ragni and Carl Meek. Josephine trembled as she looked at them. She began by chance with Meek's letters. Ragni innocent. Good God! Was she innocent? Yes. Now she understood why Edward had driven away on the day of the funeral with only Carl Meek by his side, but she could not understand how he had survived it. The servant knocked at her bedroom door, saying that supper was ready. No, no, she managed to exclaim, as she writhed in shame and sorrow. She must go at once to her brother if she had to go to him on her knees. But no. Here were Ragni's letters. She felt as if her brother were standing over her, and forcing her to read them. Some of them were early love letters. There had been no misconduct. Her chivalrous brother and the sweet, gentle woman whom he had rescued from a horrible fate had lived apart from one another in America until the day of their marriage. Josephine slipped from the chair down upon her knees, weeping and sobbing. "Forgive me. Forgive me," she whispered, pressing Ragni's letters in her hands. Then she forced herself to silence, so that no one might discover her crouching there in the shame of her crime. She had murdered her brother's wife not by words, but by her silence. Yes, she was a murderess. Well, let Edward deal with her as he thought fit. She ran wildly out of the house into the dark, rainy street, past her husband's church, past the white wall of Soren Kuhl's dwelling. Her brother was standing in the open door, surrounded by trunks and boxes. Was he thinking of going away? Tears streamed down her face. Edward. She could get no further. He drew himself upright, his face white and stern. "You shall never enter here," he said, with a break in his voice. He bent down to do up a trunk. When he got up she was gone. With a fierce look in his eyes, he continued his preparations. He meant to catch the first train the next morning, and get at once far away from his native town. What he would then do he did not know, except that he would never return. When everything was ready, he locked the front door and went to bed. But he could not sleep. Twice in the night the doorbell rang, but he would not open the door. It rang a third time, and kept on ringing, and at last he got out of bed. It was Ole Tuft. His face was ghastly. "Where is my wife, Edward Callum? What have you done with my wife?" he moaned. "Ragni's grave," said Callum. "She is there, I think." And then he slammed the door to. Just as dawn was breaking, the bell rang again. Callum went into the hall, and saw that 2 pieces of paper had been thrust through the letterbox. On one, Tuft had written, "She is not there, Edward, she was not there. I found this note on my writing table among the letters you sent her. Oh, Edward, it was not like you to send her away." On the other piece of paper Josephine had written, "Read these, Ole, and you will understand all. For my life's sake, I am now going to my brother. For my life's sake." Callum shivered as he read it, and all his old love for his sister came back to him. Had he killed her? She had wronged Ragni, true, but it was merely out of jealousy. Jealousy because he had made Ragni all in all to him, and left her out of his life. He could have brought his wife and sister together, but he had not tried to do it. He, too, was guilty. All her life long Josephine had looked up to him and worshipped him. Then he had come back from America, and cast her off, for one who was not worthy of him, so it seemed to her. And in his fierce pride he had refused to reveal to her the fine character of his wife. He rushed out of the door, resolved to find what had become of her. She was sitting on the steps of the house. As she saw him, she crouched down like a wounded bird, which cannot get away, yet must not be seen. He took her up into his arms, and carried her indoors. "Let me stay, Edward, let me stay," she said. He bent over her and kissed her. "God's ways. God's ways," said Ole Tuft, as he and Edward and Josephine walked slowly towards his house through the empty streets in the early morning. "But I still cannot share your faith," Callum said. "It matters not," said the minister. "There where good people walk, are God's ways." William Black, a daughter of Heth William Black, born in Glasgow, Scotland, the 13th of November 1841, was educated with a view to being a landscape painter, a training that clearly influenced his literary life. He became a painter of scenery in words. At the age of 23 he went to London, after some experience in Glasgow journalism, and joined the staff of the Morning Star and, later, the Daily News, of which journal he became assistant editor. His first novel appeared in 1868, but it was not until the publication of A Daughter of Heth in 1871, that Black secured the attention of the reading public. The Strange Adventures of a Phaeton followed, and in 1873 A Princess of Thule attained great popularity. Retiring from journalism the next year, voted himself